stand by for action.
Thanks, gentlemen, and Dave Miller. I am the Unpleasant Blind Guy. I want to thank Hope in My Heart for kind comments about my last program called Tales. Now, this show is titled Plague. And I know that's immediately going to send the detractors to, well, there you go, Dave, scaremongering again. But I've got a few relevant articles and a little bit of schooling about the Black Plague, which I want to impart this time, and this is relevant to people who live in the United States of America, and indeed to people that live in all the countries that are currently being inundated by massive uncontrolled immigration from Africa. We're going to start with an article that's very significant, posted November the 10th, 2017, by Christine Douglas Williams for Jihad Watch. And Americans, pay close attention to this one, because yes, there are facts in here that pertain to the United States of America. Headline: UK government discriminates against Christian refugees from Syria. This gross neglect of peaceful Christians and other minorities has been long discussed, but without any steps being taken to remedy this injustice. Instead, the UK and other Western nations have turned their backs on the most needy groups who are not only victims of war, but have been persecuted at the hands of jihadists. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, declared that politically correct officials were institutionally biased against Christian refugees in the UK. Now, this is a part that's relevant to you, Americans. In the U.S., of the 10,801 Syrian refugees who came to the U.S. under Obama in 2016, only 56 were Christian. Trump once promised that the U.S. would prioritize Christian refugees, but to date there has been no follow-up. Most disturbing about the UK was that UK officials tried to prevent the release of this information about its discrimination against Christian refugees, but Barnabas Aid submitted a Freedom of Information request to the UK Home Office and discovered the ugly truth. Christians have been abandoned not only by Western governments, but also by the largest Christian organizations globally, which have remained strangely silent. Even the Pope promised to take in Christian refugees in Italy, but then took only Muslims instead. He even called Muslim migrants warriors of hope. Vice President Pence recently offered some hope in a speech when he announced that President Trump had ordered the State Department to stop funding UN relief efforts and support directly persecuted communities through USAID. Results are now awaited. The following is the full Barnabas Aid report, which came out on November the 2nd, 2017. And Americans, though they're referring to the UK in this, they are talking about the United Nations, which is also feeding information and refugees right into the United States, right into your hometowns. Yes, even small towns. To begin, the UK government and the UN are discriminating against Christians and other minorities in their refugee programs, according to a new Home Office statistics seen by Barnabas Aid, an aid agency which works for persecuted Christians. Last week, Barnabas Aid finally obtained figures proving that the UN has only recommended tiny token numbers of Syrian Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities for resettlement in the UK. The overwhelming majority of refugees recommended by the UN have been Sunni Muslims, who form the majority in Syria. But Christians and other minorities have been repeatedly targeted for attack by Islamist groups such as the Islamic State. The new statistics, obtained in a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office by Barnabas Aid, of the religious background of Syrian asylum seekers recommended by the UNHCR for resettlement in the UK revealed. In 2015, out of 2,637 refugees, there were only 43 Christians, just 13 Yazidis, and only one Shia Muslim. In 2016, the statistics were even worse. Out of 7,499 refugees, there were only 27 Christians, 5 Yazidis, and 13 Shia Muslims. It is widely accepted that Christians made up 10% of Syria's pre-war population and Shias around 1.5%, while there are estimated to have been 70,000 Yazidis in Syria. Disturbingly, UK officials tried to prevent the release of this information. Barnabas Aid submitted a Freedom of Information request to the UK Home Office in February, and, in spite of it being legally required to release it within 28 days, officials failed to do so and repeatedly stalled or simply did not answer correspondence. Eventually, Barnabas Aid launched a formal complaint with the Information Commissioner's Office. On September the 19th, the Information Commissioner issued a formal notice requiring the Home Office to release this information within 35 calendar days or face contempt of court proceedings. Even then, the information was only released at the very last minute after Barnabas Aid had contacted the Immigration Minister's office, alerting him to the situation and asking him personally to ensure civil servants complied with the order. This is shocking behavior by both UN and UK officials. In 2005, the UN formally adopted the responsibility of states to protect citizens from genocide and crimes against humanity. These statistics show that the UN itself has failed miserably and inexcusably in this respect, said Martin Parsons, head of research at Barnabas Aid. Christians and other minorities in the Middle East have been treated shamefully by the UN, and the UK government has abjectly outsourced its own responsibilities to the victims of genocide in spite of repeated representations, he added. Barnabas Aid obtained these figures just as U.S. Vice President Mike Pence announced that the U.S. government would now directly help persecuted Christians. Now, what in the world does any of that have to do with Africa and the Black Death? It helps to establish the precedent that even though Donald Trump is President of the United States of America, the policy of allowing the mass migration of almost all combat-aged Muslim males has not ceased as this president promised it would. Now, I understand that leftist judges have been standing in the president's way on much of this, but there are ways around that, primarily being the declaration of Islam as an enemy ideology that is detrimental to both the laws and people of the United States of America. President Trump might as well do this now and start the process getting it to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. If he does that, then much of the wind can be taken out of the sails of the people who are trying to allow this mass migration of people who do not belong in this country, neither for economic nor social reasons, as Islam, through its own tenets, is incompatible with civilization. However, this has not been done, and this means continued mass migration into the United States of America, not only from Syria, but other Middle Eastern and African nations, and almost all of them are Muslims. If you don't believe me, look the figures up yourself. And the plague? How it enters into this is this way. I'm going to read you a news story that you probably haven't heard a lot about in the United States of America if all you've been looking at is the fake stream media. This is posted by Chris Pleasance from the Mail Online and updated on November the 13th, 2017. Headline: Deadly outbreak of Black Death, which has killed 140 in Madagascar, may mutate and become untreatable. A strain of plague, which has already killed more than 140 in Madagascar, could mutate and become untreatable, an expert has warned. There are fears the disease could spread to Europe and America. That's Europe and America, sports fans, via plane travel, as Ebola did in 2014, with 10 African nations already put on alert for signs of infection. Now Professor Paul Hunter has warned that while it could be easy for an advanced country to contain the disease in its current form, he fears that it could evolve into something far more dangerous. And I'll stop to say that I'm not so sure that a massive outbreak of the plague in the United States could be that easily handled by our current medical system. But to continue with the article, Hunter, a disease expert at the University of East Anglia, told the Daily Star if it reaches the UK, Europe, and the US, it would be similar to the Ebola outbreak. We would have a few isolated cases, but it shouldn't spread like it has in Madagascar. And I'll interrupt again to say that the operative word in that sentence is shouldn't. We know how the plague is spread, and we'll learn more about that later. To continue, as with any disease, it is a real worry that it mutates and becomes untreatable. In total, 2,000 people have been infected and 143 killed during the current outbreak in Madagascar, which is the country's worst in 50 years. The majority of those cases have been pneumonic plague, a more deadly form of the bubonic plague, which devastated Europe's population in the 1300s. While the bubonic plague is spread through the bites of infected fleas, pneumonic plague is spread through the air, usually by coughing. Symptoms include severe fever, headaches, and coughing, which of course is how the disease is spread. To continue, with patients often coughing up blood. It can be fatal within 72 hours of infection, though can also be cured with a course of antibiotics if administered quickly. Despite fears the plague could spread to other countries, there are signs that the infection in Madagascar is slowing down. Dr. Manitra Rakotorvny, Madagascar's Director of Health Promotion, said, "There is an improvement in the fight against the spread of the plague. There are almost no more deaths due to the plague in recent days." I'll stop to say, operative word in that sentence again being almost. Health checkpoints are in place across the country, with passengers traveling on buses and taxis needing to pass a check with a thermometer. Banks and schools have a similar check, and the trade of infrared thermometers has soared, with prices of 100,000 to 220,000 ariary, or $31 to $69 for each one. Schools and universities have been closed with a ban issued on public gatherings. The current outbreak is unusual, and it has affected urban areas increasingly at risk of transmission, according to the World Health Organization. WHO has delivered 1.2 million doses of antibiotics to fight the disease, while the Red Cross has been training hundreds of volunteers on the island to publicize preventative measures. So it sounds like the plague is under control in Madagascar and there's nothing to worry about, according to government. But there are two things they aren't talking about, which should concern you as an American. The first thing they're not talking about is the fact that some people are running away from these hospitals where they're being treated because they're afraid of needles. So, you have people running around Madagascar and possibly in the central continent of Africa itself who are infected with the plague and not seeking hospitalization. Not seeking hospitalization and possibly coming into contact with people who will be immigrating to Europe, the UK, and you guessed it, the United States of America. The second thing is what's known as the incubation period, the time between exposure to a disease and the appearance of signs or symptoms that someone has that disease, during which time someone can be a carrier and pass that disease on to someone else. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the incubation period for bubonic plague is usually 2 to 6 days. Now consider that, people. What you're talking about is 2 to 6 days for an infected person, if they're taking a plane into the United States of America, to easily infect the people at the airport where they are, on the plane where they're flying, and have a few days left over in the United States of America to walk around and spread the plague here. Now you combine that with the fact that so many of these migrants from these African countries do not have some of the same standards of cleanliness that we do here in the United States of America, and you have a potential for trouble. For some historical perspective, I refer you to this audio from the series History's Turning Points with the title The Black Death, Worst Plague in History, published on January the 5th, 2012, by CWN Entertainment on YouTube.
In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across a Europe ridden with famine and war. In just 2 years, this terrible plague was to claim over 20 million lives. Medieval man's struggle against a mysterious disease would alter the course of European history and prove a devastating turning point. In a remote lake region of Central Asia, the Bacillus Yersinia pestis lay for hundreds of years in the blood of wild rodents. Then, in 1338, a drought or an earthquake violently disturbed the balance of nature. Driven from its natural habitat, the bacillus began a deadly exodus. From its cradle in Central Asia, the plague slowly migrated towards man. It was carried in the bloodstream of black rats and in the fleas which fed on them. The bacillus spread quickly as it moved along trade routes in the blood of infected rats. With it came the plague, spreading like a deadly river of death, first into China, and then south into India, and west into Egypt and Asia Minor. Within 8 years, it had reached the Crimea. Rumors of a terrible plague raging in the east began to circulate through the Mediterranean seaports, but no one thought this disease would strike Europe. A group of Italian merchants, expelled from their trading post of Tana, had taken refuge in the fortified city of Caffa on the Black Sea. Tensions between the Christian merchants from Italy and the local Muslim residents erupted in a street brawl. A minor skirmish soon became a war. The Muslims sought help from their local Mongol prince to lay siege to the Italians inside the walls of Caffa. The siege was almost a year old when the plague erupted amongst the Mongol army. So many soldiers died that they were forced to call off the siege. But before they withdrew, the prince came up with a deadly plan, one of the first and most highly effective forms of germ warfare. Giant wooden siege machines were already lined up outside the city walls. Now, the Mongol prince ordered his troops to load the catapults with a deadly new missile. One by one, the rotting carcasses of plague-infected soldiers were hurled through the air over Caffa's walls. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city. Soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Within days, the people inside the walls of Kaffa began to die. Those merchants who could escape hurried aboard their galleys and prepared to set sail for Italy. Flea-infested rats climbed the mooring ropes and hid in the holds of the ships that were heading for the Mediterranean. Little did the sailors know what a deadly cargo they were carrying. No one noticed that the shipboard rats were diseased. The galleys sailed from port to port on their long journey back to Italy, but no one would let them dock when it was seen that the sailors were dying. In October 1347, the merchants finally reached the port of Messina in Sicily. The terrified harbour masters tried to isolate the ships, but it was already too late. Even as the first mooring ropes were being tied, the rats were making their way ashore. Although the galleys were forced to move on, this brief encounter was long enough for the Black Death to enter Europe. Europe in 1348 was already overpopulated and beset with problems. Weakened by wars, harvest failures, famines, and other epidemics, the plague was yet another in a series of disasters to strike Europe. Churches were centers of learning, with unquestioned authority over the population. With no other explanations of life to turn to, people looked to the church and their local priest for spiritual support and solace. Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar, received news of the outbreak of plague just days after its arrival in Sicily. He prayed to God that the disease would not spread.
Pater noster qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum et libera nos a malo. Amen.
But his prayers were not answered. Within days, everyone who had had any contact with the dying sailors was dead. After a week, the plague had spread throughout the city of Messina. Carts loaded with corpses arrived at the churches almost by the hour.
Men were borne to burial by day and night, with only a short service. The houses of the dead were shut up, for no one dared enter them.
Those living in already overcrowded houses were oblivious to the arrival of the infected black rats. Fleas thrived in the filth and clung to the clothes of the dead, which were then sold or passed on.
When anyone who is infected by the disease dies, all who visit him or do business with him, or even carry him to the grave, quickly follow him there.
As the plague spread into the surrounding countryside, it was clear that no one was safe. Within a month, the Black Death had spread throughout Sicily. Friar Michael set off on a journey round the island. Believing the plague was decreed by God and that man should not oppose it, he hoped to bring spiritual comfort to the sick. Many priests had already died, but Michael was one of the few who would survive the plague and live to describe its horrors.
On the day the victim was stricken, blisters and boils appeared on the arms, legs, and neck. They so weakened and tormented his body that he had to take to his bed. Soon the boils grew to the size of a walnut, then to that of a hen's egg or a goose's egg, and they were exceedingly painful. The sickness lasted 3 days. By the 4th day, the plague had claimed another victim.
People reacted to the plague with astonishment, bewilderment, and terror. They thought they were witnessing the end of the world, God's punishment for all the sin on earth.
Kind God, I beg that your anger may cease, that you do not destroy sinners in this way, and that you do not allow the just to be condemned with the unjust.
Most people believed that the plague was literally hell on earth, the last triumph of evil before the coming of Christ in judgment. With hundreds dying every day, Michael was one of the few priests still devoted enough to give the last rites and pray for the souls of the dying.
In nomine Patri, Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Such was the number of victims that there was no more hallowed ground in which to bury the dead. Corpses lay abandoned. Bodies were buried hundreds at a time in plague pits outside the city walls.
What more is there to say? Corpses lay unattended in their own homes. No priests, sons, fathers, or kinsmen dared to enter.
Few who caught the disease ever recovered. So rapidly did it spread that it seemed one man could infect the whole world. Ships, with their lethal cargoes of infected rats and fleas, were the surest and fastest means of spreading the plague. Within days of a ship putting into port, the entire town would have been exposed to the deadly bacillus. From Sicily, the plague reached the mainland and swept across Italy. Following the trade routes, it spread in all directions, covering the land with a blanket of death. Travelers told stories of deserted villages and miles of countryside littered with bodies. In early 1348, Guy de Chiliac, a cleric and the Pope's personal doctor, heard news that the Black Death was only weeks from the papal palace at Avignon. Guy studied the movement of the stars and planets and reported his findings to his master, Pope Clement VI. He explained that God's warnings, heavy clouds, blasts of hot winds, falling stars, and a column of fire seen above the papal palace all signaled that a terrible affliction was at hand.
The configuration of the heavens is the cause of this pestilence. In 1345, at 1 hour after noon on March the 20th, there was a major conjunction of 3 planets in Aquarius. This signifies death.
At once, de Chiliac scoured the books of Arab philosophers and physicians and the reports of the medical faculty in Paris for advice on how to avert the impending disaster. The philosophers advised that the corrupted air should be purified with fire. This would drive away the infected cloud that caused the plague. So when the plague was in reach of the Pope's palace, de Chiliac ordered huge fires to be built within the papal grounds. Then the doctor arranged for the Pope to sit between them. The Pope's fires burned day and night for 4 months, while the plague raged through Avignon. No rat or flea could penetrate the intense heat. The Pope sat, protected, in splendid isolation, all through the heat of the summer. Meanwhile, in the city of Avignon, thousands continued to die. They believed that the corrupted atmosphere had infected the population with plague. Regardless of the risk to himself, Guy de Chiliac visited the sick throughout the epidemic.
The disease was most humiliating for doctors who were unable to help. If they risked visiting their patients, they could do no good and so earned no fees, for almost all the infected died.
After several grueling weeks, de Chiliac finally fell ill himself. Observing the telltale boils on his own body, he took to his bed, fearing he might have only days to live. For the next 6 weeks, he attempted to treat himself. Believing his body had been corrupted by the infected cloud, he submitted to regular bleedings, using a heated cup to draw his blood to the surface of the skin, and so draw out the poisons. Whenever he could summon the strength, he would record his symptoms in detail. To his surprise, he began to record a recovery. Having survived the plague, de Chiliac was even more determined to continue his research. It was not long before he made a breakthrough.
It was of 2 types. The first with continuous fever and spitting of blood. From this, one died in 3 days. The second, also with continuous fever, but with carbuncles on the armpits and groin. From this, one died in 5 days.
De Chiliac had correctly diagnosed that there were 2 types of plague, and that the first, pneumonic plague, was more infectious and more deadly than the second, bubonic plague. So remarkable was this discovery that the Pope, for the first time, gave his blessing to the dissection of the dead, which had previously been forbidden as a sin. Most people had no confidence in doctors. The rich simply fled from the plague. But most could not. Sometimes the sick were even bricked up in their houses to stop the disease from spreading, but to no avail. Some tried to find their own cures. They took pills made of stag's horn or potions of powdered gold. Desperate times called for desperate measures.
Take a live frog and lay the belly of it next to the plague sore. If the patient will escape the plague, the frog will burst.
Having escaped the plague, the Pope sought to prevent its spread elsewhere. He ordered devout processions and encouraged ceremonies that involved a new sect, the Flagellants.
Miserere nobis, Domine. Miserere nobis, Domine.
They practiced self-flagellation in an attempt to purge mankind of sin. Flagellants roamed the countryside, believing that their self-imposed pain and suffering would cause God to lift his curse and save the world. Before long, the Flagellants openly criticized the Catholic Church for failing the people at this crucial time. They interrupted religious services and looted church property. In their search for scapegoats, they falsely accused the Jews of poisoning the drinking water. Throughout Europe, Jews were massacred. The Pope realized that the movement he himself had encouraged was now a grave threat to public order. He sent letters to the kings of Europe, ordering them to suppress the flagellants. The movement disappeared, but their dissent added to a growing feeling that perhaps the established church was no longer absolute. This dissension would resurface 150 years later in the Great Reformation. The plague would stay in any one place for several months and then move on. In just 2 years, it had swept across Western Europe, spread north over to England, and then finally to Scandinavia. By 1350, it had run its course. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population. Over 20 million people died. This devastation was a turning point that changed the face of Europe beyond recognition. Michael of Piazza recorded the chaos that the plague had left in its wake. Families were torn apart, villages deserted, business collapsed, states bankrupted by loss of taxes. Those who survived bore the burden of guilt. A new mentality emerged. There was a strengthened belief in God, but an increased skepticism about the established church. Shortage of labor had shifted the balance of power between the lords and their tenants. Authority and tradition were no longer accepted without question. The cause of the plague would remain a mystery until the late 19th century. It was then discovered that the rats and fleas were the carriers of the bacillus, but that it was the fleas that transmitted the disease from the rats to man. A single flea bite can cause death. After the Black Death, the plague returned to haunt Europe every few decades until the mid-17th century, though never again with the ferocity of that first outbreak. Even today, the terror that it created can still be heard in the nursery rhyme that children sing.
Now that video illustrates only one way that the Black Death could have entered Europe, and I find it fascinating that the makers of this program have chosen to blame Christians when shipping and trade from the Middle East and the Far East had been entering Europe from all sorts of sources by that time. Now why was one of the plagues called the bubonic plague? It's because the blisters described in the video were known as buboes, hence the name bubonic plague. And the line in the old nursery rhyme, "a pocket full of posies," probably refers to the act of placing flowers in one's pocket back in those days, in the hopes that it would somehow drive off the plague. I suspect because flowers smell nice, and, as you heard in the video, contaminated air was thought to be a primary secular cause. Frankly, not too far off, and the result of what I would call observational science, but, as we know and as they could not have known, The air was actually infected with viri from those already carrying the plague coughing. Now the question comes up, why haven't the elites in our government and media been saying very much about this outbreak of plague? The reasons are many, and no, none of them are because it's not that big a deal. Firstly, they know that the people would demand that borders be closed and immigration from affected countries be halted immediately. This would stop the Islamization program, which is currently underway in shadow governments all over the West, including the United States of America. But there's an economic component to this as well, and it can be found in the succeeding years after the first major outbreak of plague in Europe. Quite simply, before the outbreak of plague in Europe in the 12th century, there were too many people, too little food, and too few jobs. As the video said, famine was rife in Europe. People were actually dying of starvation, and there just weren't enough jobs around for the people to be able to fill them. After the initial outbreak of the plague killed so many, though, the population was drastically decreased. Suddenly, there were enough jobs for everyone, and the land could support all of the people of Europe. Death from starvation went down to almost nothing in comparison. Now contrast that situation with today. In Western countries, North America, South America, Europe, Russia, even making inroads into China, you have millions of migrants coming in, and at the same time you have an increase in technology, which means there are fewer unskilled labor type jobs. At the same time, if you read the papers from all of these countries that are currently being invaded by these migrants, the one thing they want to do when they get to these countries is have sex, and procreate their brains out. So that means that the populations go up and up and up, while the arable land and the economic structure to support them goes further and further and further down. So what's a solution for this problem? Well, the ones that I and many people who agree with me propose are the hard solutions. Sending these people back to their own nations and telling them to make a go of their nations themselves in their own nations, much as we did when we were starting out our countries. Those are the hard solutions. But if you think like a globalist, the easy solution would be something that would drastically reduce the population, thus preserving a longer lived period of no-lint socialism. If the population is drastically reduced, then even though the civilized countries of the world are switching over to 21st century economies with things like robotics, those who are left, who get the freebies and simply vote for the globalists, can be supported and the system can be perpetuated for a few more years. And remember, in the mind of the globalist people, I'm talking about Democrats, the Labour Party in the UK, and even in some cases, sadly, establishment Republicans, the lives of people make no difference as long as they can maintain power. Is it any wonder that the fake stream media isn't talking about this story and the possible dangers of plague in the 21st century? Think about it, and then begin encouraging your representatives to start working on declaring Islam a detrimental enemy ideology in the United States of America. We can do the hard things that will at least blunt the thrust of these problems, if we will just do it. And I'm going to put supporting documents for this program at UBG Contact on Twitter. That's where you can contact me with comments, questions, show suggestions, Awesome American suggestions. It is the main contact point for the show. But I'm also Dave Milner at Facebook, the Tea Party Community, and Connect with Liberty, and I'm Agador on Gab. And now it's time for the Awesome American segment. Let's ride. Now I love doing Awesome American segments about motorcycle clubs and motorcycle riders, Just things about motorcycles. Because I'm a dude, and I like motorcycles. So here we go with a story by Alexandra Icomoni, which was posted on Tuesday, November the 21st, 2017, for WXFL-TV, Channel 31, Albany, Georgia. Headline: Motorcycle Club rides around town giving Thanksgiving baskets. Albany, Georgia. The Viper Unit Motorcycle Club got their bikes and rode around town to give families boxes filled with food to cook a great Thanksgiving meal. Inside each box is a turkey, wings, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, canned goods, you name it. The club packed up a truck filled with boxes and they delivered them to several houses. The goal is to lend a hand to those who can't afford to buy everything needed to make a Thanksgiving meal. I am happy because I didn't get anything for Thanksgiving, but thanks to the biker boys, my kids will have a blessed and lovely Thanksgiving, LaShala Worthy, one of the recipients, said. The same families that received a Thanksgiving basket will get a Christmas basket with some of the same food, but will have toys and Christmas decorations included. Well, what can I say, people? Too many think that bikers are these big, scary types that are always getting in fights and hurting people and things of that nature, and I won't deny that some of that does go on. But that's not all bikers. In fact, that's not most bikers. Most people who ride motorcycles do it just because they like the freedom of riding a motorcycle. And these clubs that do these things on these holidays, and organizations like Bikers Against Child Abuse, show the true colors of the open road freedom movement in the United States of America. They are awesome Americans. And that is it for this time. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for listening, and may your God go with you. Goodbye. The Unpleasant Blind Guy is copyright 2017. Anno Domini.